I'm going to ask, as your pastor, that believe it or not, we have approximately 60 hours left between now and then. And you know what then is. It's when we, as a nation, either inhale deeply or exhale deeply, depending on our perspective. But I'm going to ask you to pray and ask God to grant each and every one of us a measure of wisdom, a measure of righteousness, and a measure of peace. And again, in this moment of extraordinary national significance, that we once again remind ourselves that our greater allegiance goes to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and we are enlisted in the building of His kingdom, not our nation's kingdom. And I'm praying that we don't, as individuals and as a nation and as a congregation, we don't give in to the seduction of the politics and the emotions of this moment, because politics and emotions, as your life has told you, they change, don't they? But the kingdom of heaven, that's forever. The kingdom's forever. And we've been talking for the last 7 weeks, and I will be really happy when we move on to something else. We've been talking about politics and religion. And politics, for our definition, is the activities associated with the governance of a country or kingdom. We're talking about the governance and the activities associated with the kingdom of heaven, with the righteous kingdom. But first, a question. How and when did we learn that it was really, really, really unwise to talk about religion and politics in a family gathering? How did we learn this? What happened? Yeah, it would always lead to an argument, right? And the argument went something like this. I'm right, and they are idiots, right? Of course. And that's where we stand as a nation. And when a political faction, whether they're liberal or conservative or independent or green or socialist or Romulan, it doesn't matter. When any political ideology or identity steps up and lays claim to the moral high ground, and that their perspective, their ideology is the only one that is truly humanitarian, truly virtuous, truly reasoned, when those things come into conflict, there is going to be an argument, isn't there? And James, even though he's writing to a church body, he nailed this. In the 4th chapter of James, he says, where do you think fighting and endless conflict come from? Don't you think that they originate in the constant pursuit of gratification that rages inside each of you like an uncontrolled militia? Doesn't that sound like social media in our environment? There is a rage going on behind every political ideology. Yet in the middle of this fighting over whose direction the moral compass is kind of pointing toward and laying claim to that, there's come a point of agreement between the major liberal and conservative parties. And I want to know if you picked up on this too. And I read it. It kind of confirmed something that I'd been seeing in newspaper and television accounts. And a New York Times reporter saw the same thing. And it's this, that both liberals and conservatives had begun to use a form of the same tagline. And see if you've seen this. We're in a battle for the soul of America. Maybe you've seen it. I've seen the Democratic campaign use it. I've also seen the Republican campaign use it. We're in the battle for the soul of a nation, battle for the soul of America. But what does that even mean? You know, it sounds like beautiful rhetoric, doesn't it? It sounds like some high and lofty ideal. But nobody can identify what they mean by that. And I've been thinking this week, does a nation have a soul? I don't know that they do. A nation has ideals. A nation has hopes and dreams and aspirations. like freedom, liberty, democracy, and justice. But those don't make up a soul. The fight really is over American ideals and which ideals are going to reign. And further, if the stakes are that high, if we are in a battle for the soul of the nation, then why doesn't anybody agree? If it's that urgent, that important, and we're talking about the soul of a nation, why isn't there a conciliatory tone? In fact, over the course of this year, over 2020, we've seen people at the highest levels of government this year who would rather be knowingly and factually wrong and untrue than agree with their political adversary. It's extraordinary. In American politics, in the politics of today, planet Earth, an enemy is easy to spot. They are the person that disagrees with you. That's why we led off this entire series with Jesus talking about loving our enemies. We have to be past that. I've certainly not heard anybody this election cycle say something like, well, I'm voting for this particular candidate because it's going to be best for the soul of our nation. No. No. Every vote has an ideology, a perspective behind it. Even in our extraordinarily patriotic state of Idaho, almost everything that we stand for, or everything that we stand against, is bent in the direction of our self-interest. Not what's best for the soul of America, but what's best for me. Do you know how hard it would be to get elected in Canyon County if you even whispered that you had an idea of raising property taxes? Right? We want we want better roads than Ada County. We want better schools than Ada County. We want better teachers than Ada County. But God forbid you ask me to step up and pay. That was a teacher giggling there. But do you know what I'm saying? We want the best of the best of the best of the best of the best, but we don't want to pay. We want what's best for ourselves. And so as followers of Jesus, how do we take off the yoke of politics? And you guys know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a yoke. It's one of those devices that fits over your shoulders, and you've seen people carrying milk cans or whatever. You know, it's that thing that helps you shoulder a burden. How do we take off the yoke of politics and replace it with the yoke of Jesus, who he says is lighter, and it also carries the concerns of God rather than concerns of humankind? It takes the God perspective into account, which exposes a much greater reality than what we're thinking about between Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden. How do we take that off? We take it off by acknowledging the true concerns of God. So many times in this political realm, in this political environment, again, that moral posturing, God is on my side. God is on my side. We are asking God to agree with us without asking the question, how can we agree with God? That's what the kingdom politic is about. How do we take on the yoke of Jesus and the concerns of God in this day and in this Caldwell context? How do we do that? And there's this incredibly tense moment that Matthew recalls for us. Matthew was one of the eyewitnesses, and he wrote an account of Jesus' life. And there was this disciple who went from saying something extraordinarily profound, something that had never been uttered before, in one moment. The next moment he says something that gets him the greatest scolding and reprimand in all of Scripture. He said something so profound that Jesus had to stop his dialogue and say, oh my goodness, that was outstanding. In the next minute, Jesus is giving him a timeout. Have you ever had one of those moments? Maybe you raised your hand and when the teacher asked a question and you had an extraordinary answer, teacher said, "That's brilliant, Jim." That never happened, of course, but you go from 1 minute just saying something beyond yourself to the next minute, putting your feet back in a pile of poo, where you're usually standing. And we've all had those moments, from the penthouse to the outhouse in just a matter of seconds. And Peter had just for the first time uttered these words, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." First time it's ever been proclaimed. And Jesus is absolutely stunned. He says, "Wow, Peter, well done. I know you. You did not get this on your own. The Spirit spoke to you. The Spirit revealed this to you. Attaboy, way to go." And immediately, Matthew writes, Jesus used the intensity and the tension in this moment to lay out the next steps of the kingdom's movement forward. Matthew says in chapter 16, starting at the 21st verse, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. Now remember, in their world at that time, everything is in one basket: religion, politics, and the war machine. Okay? So this would be, in our context, like Jesus going before Congress, the Supreme Court, the executive branch, Joint Chiefs of Staff. They are all in the room. So this is a highly charged religious and political gathering Jesus is talking about. Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day raised to life. When Peter, the man of the moment, the man who has just said something brilliant, took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, what did he say? "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me." Can you imagine the disciple who has just clearly heard the Spirit of God speak, the one who just for the first time called Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who had just now received the praise of his rabbi, had gone from a prophetic voice to a stumbling block in a matter of moments? Can you imagine hearing those words from your rabbi, who 2.5 years ago, when he said, "Come and follow me," you dropped everything and you followed, and you've been following him ever since? Stumbling blocks are a hindrance. They're a bother. They're totally unnecessary. Stumbling blocks are just a colossal waste of time. They're a setback. They cause more work. And can you imagine Peter's confusion? Peter's probably thinking, okay, you're going to suffer at the hands of the religious and government elitists. In fact, you say they're going to kill you, and you're telling me I am the stumbling block? How can that be? Jesus tells it. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Now, Peter wasn't the only disciple of the 12 who was pursuing his own interests from inside this kingdom movement. James and John, the mother of James and John, Judas, they all had their own interests in this. Peter has to decide, which one of these kingdoms am I really pursuing? Am I pursuing the kingdom of the world, which Jesus has just told me are merely human concerns? Or am I sold out to the mission that contains the concerns of God? According to Jesus, then, the political obsessions that we hold on to as so critical to our life and happiness are merely human concerns. And here's my thought. If I allow myself to get so entrenched, as many Christians have this year, in a political struggle that Jesus calls merely human concerns, have I become, like Peter, the stumbling block to the movement of his kingdom? Jesus was just about, he was at that moment where he's moving forward, and everything that Peter saw as a perceived stumbling block to Jesus, government elitists, the threat of death, the persecution, the war machine of Rome, everything that Peter saw as an obstacle, Jesus saw as an opportunity and a launch pad for his mission. So as we look around the world and we see what's going on in different places, and we see terrorism, and we see unrest, and we see racial injustice, could that be God's posturing for his next movement? Could it? Jesus used it as ground zero for the resurrection. Every naysayer, whether it was religion, whether it was government, whether it was Rome, was gathered in one place, and he came out of a grave to show who was really in charge. Brilliant. Then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, must deny their ambitions and their political ideologies, and take up their cross and follow me. See, when we give ourselves to Jesus, he can break the chains of our political obsession, of our need to be engaged in that particular form of entertainment. And no matter how virtuous or how just or how fair or how equitable or patriotic or and how Christ-centered some of the ideals that are flashed in front of our screens might seem to be, they're not the same as the concerns of God. People like Peter and James and John and Judas tried to use the growing popularity of Jesus to leverage their own wants and needs and self-interests to their own political ends. You remember the two boys, James and John, their mom came, and then the conversation was, can one of these boys sit at your right hand and one at your left hand when your kingdom is established and they crown you king? Jesus said, you don't know what you're asking. Jesus said at this gathering, for whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. When Jesus returns to establish his kingdom in his fullness, and we're able to see him face to face, the question will be, what good will it have been for you to have gained the whole world yet forfeited your soul for the sake of merely human concerns? And if we're going to follow Jesus, we have to learn Peter's lesson. Yeah, he's following Jesus. Yeah, in a way, he's leveraging Jesus' popularity for his own self-interest. And yes, Peter's concerns are not the same as Jesus' concerns and God's concerns. Peter expected the redemption of the nation Israel and a restoration of Israel to its former glory and prominence on the world stage. But the kingdom of heaven came to redeem not just Israel, all of mankind. Peter's mindset was consumed with the human concerns of national pride, justice, and political power. But as Jesus is saying, you can gain all that. You can get all that. And too late you found out that you have actually forfeited your soul. No, what you've actually done is you've traded it away. You've given it away. Peter's interest was self-interest, as was James and John and Judas. Peter sees this coming humiliation and the persecution of Jesus and the crucifixion. He saw that as the end of this movement, that it's all going to be over. And Jesus saw it as the way forward. At that climactic moment, Peter drew his weapon and drew blood. What did Jesus do? He healed. Peter saw Jesus' political enemies as the adversary. But Jesus saw them as leverage, whereby he'd be able to silence all criticism of who he was, who he said he was. And the criticisms of religion and politics and the machines of war would be silenced when he steps out of the grave. And as Christians, it is right and proper to stand up for our American ideals. American soldiers fought and died to protect the ideals of freedom and liberty and justice and democracy across the world. Because these are such tremendous ideals, there's always going to be an adversary. But right now, there's an even greater adversary, because not just nations are at stake, souls are at stake. As followers of Christ, our focus has to be on the concerns of God. The concerns of God. Where our battle is for every soul that's being forfeited in this moment. Those are greater stakes. We're going to end now with a moment of benediction and blessing. We're going to be reading from Ephesians. In warfare, a soldier on the front lines usually won't know what's going on other front lines, in other parts of the war, in other parts of the battle. His enemy is the one in his line of sight, the one he sees in front of him. They're both soldiers. They're both following orders. And they're following the orders of an unseen commander somewhere, who along with other authorities are making decisions. The call to the church is to make sure you know who your enemy is. In Ephesians 6, as Paul is writing to this church, he narrows it down for us, and it's so helpful. He says, finally, in the midst of your cultural context, in the midst of this struggle for the emerging church that you guys are trying to establish there in Ephesus, finally let the Lord make you strong. Depend on his mighty power. Put on all of God's armor. Then you can remain strong against the devil's evil plans. And listen to this. And take this with you this week. Our fight is not against human beings. It is against the rulers, the authorities, and the powers of this dark world. It is against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly, the unseen world. The fight is bigger. The fight is bigger than we know. The enemy is not the one we can see. So put on all of God's armor. Evil days will come, but you will be able to stand up to anything. And after you've done everything you can, you will still be standing. So remain strong in the faith. There's going to be a lot of rhetoric on both sides when this election is over this week. Our fight is not against human beings. It's against the rulers, the authorities, and the powers of this dark world. It is against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly world. The greatest witness the church can be this week is to be peacemakers. Don't give in to the rhetoric. Look for points of commonality. And as we come to this table this morning, and Jesus has talked with his guys here about what it's going to entail. The persecution, the humiliation, the crucifixion, it's all represented right here in front of us. And the bread that represents his body that was savagely torn up, and the blood that spilled from his body. I'd like you to consider committing to peace this week. I don't care if I win or lose. I have my opinions. But my opinions are triumphed by God's concern for this world. And if I see something on the horizon that looks ominous, I'm going to say, God is up to something. Look at the world that God used to bring about our redemption in Christ's resurrection. These are days for extraordinary hope. God has been so good to us.